The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Lucy Johnstone, a clinical psychologist, writer, and a leading voice in reimagining mental health care. Lucy is one of the key developers of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, a philosophical approach that challenges traditional diagnostic models of mental distress and offers a more compassionate, contextual understanding of human experiences. In our conversation, we explore the Power Threat Meaning Framework in depth, discussing how it reframes mental health by focusing on the impact of power, threat, and meaning in people's lives, rather than relying on medicalized labels. Lucy shares her insights on how this framework can transform the way that we support individuals experiencing distress, moving away from a disease-based model towards one that acknowledges the social, relational, and cultural factors at play. Lucy's work is a powerful call to rethink the foundations of mental health care, and I'm so excited to share this thought-provoking discussion with you. So let's jump straight in. Lucy, a big thank you for coming onto the program today, especially knowing that you're broadcasting all the way in from the UK, which is quite late in the evening compared to where it is here in Canberra. So thank you so much for coming on.
Not at all. I'm pleased to be here. Look forward to our discussion.
Look, I'm very excited to find out more about you along with the Power Threat Meaning Framework. So maybe we can start with both of those, a little bit about you, how you've come to this model, and maybe begin with giving us a bit of a overview of the framework.
Okay. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist like you, and I'm based in Bristol, UK, southwest of England. I'm someone who's always had a critical perspective on what we could, for shorthand, call the medical model throughout my whole career, and everything I've written and all my practice and various training courses I've been involved in and academic settings has all been really based on that central premise that we need to have better ways of understanding distress than the medical understanding. So by the medical understanding, I mean the very widespread idea that people who are in very real forms of distress are suffering from medical illnesses of some sort that need a diagnostic label and that probably need treating largely by medications. I don't believe in any of that, and I never have. I have visited Australia a few times, and these kind of strange ideas are not unheard of in the UK. I think they're much newer to the typical professional on Australia. That's my impression, that the medical model is more deeply embedded in Australia, though it certainly is also the dominant model in the UK. So I've done an awful lot of different things in my long career to promote non-medical understandings, and we can talk about some of them if we want, but in a way the kind of peak of that is a very long and large project which is called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And the Power Threat Meaning Framework, it'll probably take most of our time this evening to describe it, but if I can start by making it as brief as possible. The Power Threat Meaning Framework was put together with me and my colleague Mary Boyle, who's also a clinical psychologist, as lead authors. And it had 8 main authors in total. Most of us are psychologists. 2 of us are what in the UK we would call survivors, people who've experienced psychiatry from the receiving end, so to speak, or consumers. I don't know what term you use in Australia. Together with a large group of other people who provided input of various types. And we started writing it collectively, kind of accidentally, in 2012, and we finally published it in 2018. It was funded by the Division of Clinical Psychology, which is a subsection of the British Psychological Society, So it has a certain amount of, professional endorsement, but it's not an official BPS model. Some psychologists like it, some don't. Some are undecided, some like bits of it. And it's not actually particularly about psychology. It's got a much broader agenda than that. But nevertheless, it's been very useful to have the BPS's support because they have published it. And at the end of the programme, I hope there will be links to the main PTMF website. On that website, you can find links to the documents which are free to download, free to read. It's quite important to us that nobody has to pay to understand about this or to have access to the documents. So what is that all about? Well, the 8 main authors who put together the PTMF were all people who've known each other for many, many years. I think I've known Mary, the other lead author, for over 30 years. None of us have ever believed in the diagnostic model of distress from our various perspectives, which include clinical perspectives, academic perspectives, research perspectives, lived experience perspectives. All of us have tried in various ways throughout our careers and our lives to promote alternative understandings. And we kind of accidentally came together for a different purpose in November 2012 and started an impromptu discussion about what would an alternative to diagnostic model look like. And by that, we don't mean just specific alternatives, of which there are quite a lot. Some forms of therapy are non-diagnostically based. We have quite a lot of projects in the UK which are not diagnostically based. But we wanted something much more ambitious than that. We wanted a kind of overarching conceptual framework. We wanted the very core principles of an alternative way of thinking, which would underpin and support every other non-diagnostic approach, if you like, give it greater credibility, give it an evidence base, and hopefully provide a step towards making those, numerous different approaches actually the dominant model instead of the diagnostic one.
Lucy,
So
could I just jump in and double click on?
please do, yes. Please interrupt at any point because I'm capable of talking
No,
quite a long
no,
time.
I'm absolutely loving where you're going.
Yes.
Yeah. You and your colleagues came together somewhat by chance, and there was a commonality of all recognizing some type of shortfall for the current understanding of distress, the mainstream understanding of distress.
Exactly.
Can you tell me more about what those shortfalls were for you? What stood out? What were those commonalities within among your peers, yourself and your peers?
Yes, I'd probably put it a lot stronger than shortfalls. This is a fundamentally mistaken and profoundly damaging way of understanding distress, which is not evidenced and never has been. So, I mean, you've interviewed Joanna Moncrief, I know, who's a friend and colleague of mine, but I mean, she comes from a very similar perspective, and her particular interest is in the use of drugs, as you know. So her perspective is very compatible with ours. We've quoted from her work. But essentially she's saying, well, psychiatric drugs aren't medical treatments, though they may have some uses. And we are saying in a rather similar way, well, forms of distress are not medical illnesses. We have a whole paradigm, if you like, which is fundamentally mistaken. We cannot apply a model that actually works, pretty well to things in relation to things that go wrong in our bodies. We've had huge advances in the treatment of cancer and heart disease and so on over the last 50 years. We cannot apply that to understandings of what we call emotional suffering and what some people call mental illness. It's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely mistaken, and it leads to many, many damaging consequences. So that's the shortfall. I mean, you could elaborate that in all sorts of ways and show how devastating this shortfall is. But I think, I'm wondering how this comes across to an Australian audience. I think I'd like to point out that a lot of what I do when I teach and train on this subject to do public speaking is I say that the very people who actually brought this way of thinking into being and are its main proponents are admitting the same thing. So it's not just us kind of strange maverick UK people with our daft ideas. Dr. Alan Francis, who, as you may know, is the chair of the DSM-4 committee, has openly said the DSM-5 is neither scientific neither safe nor scientifically sound. And Dr. Thomas Insel, the former chair of the NIMH, which is the world's largest funding body for mental health in America, is one of the people who's trying to essentially rewrite the diagnostic manuals from scratch. You know, these are establishments, like, you don't get more establishment than that. They are admitting these categories are not valid, they're not evidence-based, they're not based in science. Now, if you push them, they'll say, well, they're the best we've got at the moment, so we have to hold on to them. And I've never believed that. But we wanted to provide a fuller answer to, well, if we don't use that, what do we do instead? So everything's wrong with it. It is the short answer. Everything's wrong with it.
And that's based on the fundamental principle that human experience that we might describe as distress is not abnormal.
Yeah.
These are natural reactions to unwanted experiences, difficult situations, etc. That we actually expect people to have, because the circumstances, the context, the history taking, if you will, from a psychologist's perspective, kind of explains the normality of why someone might be feeling the way they're feeling, or why someone might be behaving potentially the way that they're behaving. There's more of an appreciation and understanding of the context, rather than saying there's something biologically wrong with you.
Yes, I wouldn't phrase it quite like that, because I think the word abnormal is tricky.
Sure, please.
It has a number of different meanings, doesn't it? I mean, it may not be statistically normal to kind of hear hostile voices or have extreme mood swings, but it may not, it may mean that living your kind of normal life is very disrupted, if you like. So, but I think what we're saying is it's ultimately understandable, even if at times extremely distressing and extremely disruptive. That's what we're saying. Always a way of understanding it.
Yeah. And that's such a good point, and hence why these conversations are so useful and powerful for me and hopefully listeners as well. The word abnormal immediately puts in a judgment of right and wrong.
Well, who says what's normal? Exactly.
Opposition versus more of an understanding of all human experiences under an umbrella. So you can have hostile voices within that umbrella, all the way through to the opposite end as well. And you can see that within a population, period. And then we don't have to go and say any more. The person who's distressed by hostile voices can be supported. We can look after them in the way. Similarly, you can actually have voices that are incredibly encouraging, that are also quite unhelpful, and might lead to reputational damage if followed blindly. So we can talk about it in an experience descriptive way, more so than a judgment of calling it normal, abnormal. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
So the framework doesn't believe in boundaries between normal, abnormal, mad and sane, mentally ill and mentally well. But it also doesn't believe, and this is more or less what you've just said, that there's a cut-off point between different, at some point, which means certain experiences are fundamentally different from other kinds of human experience. Yeah. So all those things are true.
And thank you, and please jump in, because language, I think, is at the heart of this, because there's nuance, there's meaning that needs to be untangled to properly understand concepts. I think that's part of the human condition. We struggle with it. We miss the nuance, or we make big broad statements, and I'm obviously guilty of that as well. Well,
we're obsessed with language. The authors of the framework are obsessed with language, so I will jump in about language, and feel free to do the same, of course.
Maybe this is a good segue into talking about the PTM framework, how I suppose some of those fundamentals and a bit broader there.
Okay, so because it's a kind of philosophical document more than anything else. It's not a plan for services. It's not a do it like this. It's quite abstract, deliberately so. because we think unless we fundamentally change the way we think, then, nothing else will really fundamentally change. So because of that, it's actually quite dense and difficult to read. So there are various shorter versions on the website which are more accessible. And there's also, I hope at the end of this talk, there's a book, a link to a book, which we hope is very much about how might you, in very practical terms, apply this to yourself or someone you're supporting or working with. So there's various versions of it, but the absolute essence of it can probably be summed up in a number of quite short ways. So first of all, the answer to what do we use instead of diagnosis is we use narrative understandings. So as psychologists, in the UK, we very often use the concept of formulation, which I assume you do in Australia as well. So I've spent a lot of my career promoting training, writing about formulation. I think it's very, very useful. I think it's most applicable in certain settings. It's not, for example, appropriate cross-culturally necessarily. So our concept of narrative would include formulation, be much broader than formulation. Throughout history, humans have made meaning of their distress through narrative, whether that's through song, through dance, through cultural rituals, through, all sorts of ways throughout the millennia. So narrative instead of diagnosis, and it's particularly important in the framework that those narratives explicitly make the link between personal distress and social and political contexts. So obviously a narrative is about making sense, and a formulation is about making sense by kind of saying this happened and therefore this explains why I feel in this way, but we want to push that a whole lot further than most formulation-based practice does. So essentially we're saying the roots of our suffering are nearly always to be found in social and political inequality and injustice. And I wouldn't want to push that too far, and it doesn't mean that you necessarily focus on that in any particular individual case, but I think we have to be aware of the roots of our suffering, really. And thirdly, it follows from that, power, as in power, threat, meaning framework, is the bit that we think we've put back in that diagnosis by definition excludes. So the power, threat, meaning framework starts by looking at power in all its forms. So that's, we've got a number of ways of talking about different forms of power in the framework. That's interpersonal power, the way people can hurt or abuse or traumatize or neglect or abandon each other and so on. We've got legal power, we've got coercive power, we've got social capital, the kind of advantages that we're born with or that we acquire. Most importantly, in some ways, we have ideological power, which means, this is back to language again, in a way, the kind of standards, expectations, norms that are conveyed to us, all sorts of sources, what our parents say, what we're taught at school, what the media says, what our politicians say. And every society has those, and we need those. We need norms and standards of behaviour. But ideological power can be a process of deliberately misusing that, often by distorted language or very carefully, reframed language, so that certain forms of power, financial power, business power, political power, can be perpetuated, and people at the bottom can be somehow persuaded that it's their fault, or that, that their problems lie elsewhere. And one of the most explicit uses of ideological power, we think, is through a diagnostic retelling of your life story. You have bipolar disorder, you have schizophrenia. So that's quite a clever way of wrapping up someone's distress, disconnecting it from its social context, individualizing the problem. It's your fault, it's your brain chemistry, it's your inadequacy, it's your mental illness, thus very much stopping people themselves from making sense of their distress in terms of context, but also as a whole society, it's a very, very useful mechanism essentially for silencing people. And that, we would argue, is actually the main purpose of psychiatry. Which is performed very effectively. If you want to push that further, there are a lot of people who've said that the medical model of psychiatry emerged along with industrialization, when there was a greater need to kind of sweep up social casualties of the new kind of social order. It's a relatively recent form of ideological power. We didn't have it about 150 years ago. Some cultures worldwide are lucky enough to still not have it. The human race has survived without it for about 200,000 years. What's it doing there? Well, it's shielding a lot of powerful interests, and it's doing a lot of individual people a lot of harm, is what we would say.
There's somewhat, when there's a power imbalance or perceived power imbalance, or the experience of a power imbalance, there is disempowerment, which often can be experienced from the human in quite low mood, depressed mood, if you will, that makes us feel awful that we don't have influence over our lives, or at least in the long term, that can be quite distressing and anxiety provoking as well. Like the apprehension of what tomorrow might look like, particularly if someone's living on the edge, so to speak, with, let's say, financial distress. They don't know what tomorrow brings. They're potentially afraid of how they might be perceived within the workplace. There's a social tension with managers, peers, bosses, colleagues. It's quite a lot to carry on a day-to-day basis. If I think about this from a explanatory perspective, we know that people who go to war have an awful difficult time when they're in a state of war for a prolonged period of time, in that there's a norm of there's a norm experience of potentially being killed at any moment. Every time you hear a bomb being dropped, those whistles, sirens, you're in such an alert phase, state, that's difficult to try and understand when you come back to a non-threat, experience.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. So in PTMF terms, we would say that we need to link the threat response to the threat. So your threat response is remaining hyper alert because you had to be hyper alert, vigilant then, etc. And from a PTMF point of view, it actually doesn't make a lot of sense to then say, oh, well, you've got PTSD, because that's what we would call disconnecting the threat response from the threat. And the risk of that is then we start treating the PTSD, and then we somehow, in a way, we're giving a message that, the problem is this disorder you've got, rather than it can be completely explained as an understandable reaction to what you've been through.
Yeah.
And we have so many variations of that. Women who've been sexually abused ending up being told they have borderline personality disorder because they're displaying anger and distrust. Well, what do you expect? There's so many people living in poverty who kind of get depressed. Well, it's very depressing to live in poverty, as you've just said. So a PTMF narrative tries to kind of put back the link between the distress and the context in a way that actually makes sense.
Is there, jumping a little bit forward, is there pushback or reservations from clients in this type of approach, or is part of the model about how this is actually discussed, so that there isn't a clash between the two models, but rather one that's curious and trying to understand and being thoughtful and considered and kind, but also one that can maybe dissect or double click into present narratives that have these categories, because our clients come to us with categories. They say, I've got this, I've got that, obviously this is reinforced so much in today's world, everything from the ease of social media, but also from health professionals, that health professionals in Australia, to come and see a psychologist and have a Medicare rebate applied, you have to be given a diagnosis. So the GP has to actually provide a category to to perform that action. And if that action's not performed, then you don't get a rebate. And so it's kind of built into the system.
Yes. Just before I get onto that, can I, if I explain something a little bit more about the framework, then I think
Please.
we've kind of covered the essence of the framework, and then I'll get onto that question.
Thank you.
So the bit that I'd just like to slip in here is that the framework suggests a structure for narratives that are non-diagnostic, and it's not something anyone has to do, and the questions aren't meant to be in a rigid order, and you can change the wording if you want, and it's a kind of circular process. It's not a one-off. A story is an evolving process. But the PTM framework essentially has 4 core questions. So the first one is what has happened to you, and in PTMF terms, we say how is power operating in your life. So in the documents and in the link to the book that I mentioned, there's expansion on what we mean by that and how you might start thinking about it. The second question, which very much leads on from that, is how did that affect you? In other words, what kind of threats does this pose? So in the case of your person returning from the war, their physical safety would be threatened. There'd be all sorts of ways in which they'd obviously feel under threat. The third question, what sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of these experiences? So that could be all sorts of things, from I'm a failure to I'm not safe to, people can't be trusted or whatever. And the fourth question is, what did you have to do to survive? What kinds of threat responses are you using? So again, that could be lots of things. I self-harm, I hear voices, I remain hypervigilant. So that's the basics of a PTMF narrative. It's not completely different from what a lot of psychologists do anyway. It could be used as another way of doing a formulation, or also you could use your existing way of formulating and maybe see if this has anything to add. So it's a kind of flexible addition. And we also think it's important to start or end with what are your strengths? What resources can you draw on? So that's a PTMF narrative. And has there been client pushback? Well, what I usually say to this is, well, partly the framework isn't meant to be just about clients. I mean, that might be the main concern of people who are watching, but to go back to about 10 minutes ago, it's about all of us. We all experience distress, we all struggle, we all feel confused about why we're feeling X, Y, and Z. So it's kind of broader than clients. And the book that I mentioned is very much, you can use it as a self-help book. It doesn't have to be a case if you go along to professional. People are naturally meaning makers and sense creators. So it's a demedicalizing approach, but it's also a deprofessionalizing approach to some extent. I think I'm a professional, you're a professional. I think there's a role for professionals, but I don't think we all have to wait on a psychologist's, long waiting list for a year to construct a story. And if we're given a few tools, we certainly can do it ourselves. So, but if we are talking about clients, then I think that's the tension which has been throughout my career between what clients bring, as you say, I've got this, I think I may have a case of this, I've been told I've got this, and the message of the whole system, and the approach which I bring, which is very different. And of course, at a pragmatic level and at a level of respect for the client, I'm not going to charge you and say, nonsense, that's rubbish. We need to do this instead. I mean, of course I'm not. So I, like any decent psychologist, and like you, I'm sure I would offer alternatives. I would say, well, let's expand this conversation. Let's think a bit more. Well, is this proving helpful? Does this give you any new ideas? What seems to make sense to you? What are the implications? Shall we continue this conversation? And, the approach of the framework as a whole is really, really, we're not about imposing anything on anyone. If people like it, that's great. If people think it's terrible, that's fine. If nobody wants to read it, that's fine. It's been mischaracterized. I mean, we might want to talk about this a bit. It's had quite a lot of general pushback, and a lot of that's based on extreme mischaracterizations, like we're on a power trip ourselves and we want to impose the framework across services and across the country, and nothing could be further from the truth. If we were doing that, we'd be falling into the same trap as the diagnostic model. So ironically, a lot of the criticisms that come our way are much better directed towards the diagnostic perspective. And to answer the second part of your question, it's also true that diagnosis is very deeply embedded in welfare systems, criminal justice system. And of course, as a psychologist, I would never refuse to endorse a diagnosis if someone needed it for their welfare claim or whatever. We do have to live alongside these systems to some extent, although I don't agree with them, but I don't want anyone to suffer for, my particular beliefs about that. But I think what I would do is have a conversation with someone about that. I wouldn't just say, you've got schizophrenia, tick. I would say, to get your benefits or whatever it is you need, we need to put something in this box. Now, you and I don't have to understand it like this, but what would be an acceptable label that would get you what you need and that you can live with?
And these, I suppose, criticisms of the model, what are they pointing at, and who is criticizing this side? Because what I'm hearing, and this is still a very basic cursory understanding from what we've discussed, a little bit of reading, but I'm not seeing anything threatening in this. I'm hearing a very curious, narrative-led conversation or guided conversation to explore what's happened to somebody, how they've responded, the meaning that they've made, that's come from that, that they've placed on that, how they therefore look at the world, the filter that they are looking through, the things that they've had to do to somehow cope, adjust, compensate, adapt, and even towards the end, I think you mentioned even the strengths-based approach about how have you gotten through some difficult time?
I mean, a lot of this isn't new, is it? It really isn't new. I'm sure it's what any decent therapist does anyway. Yeah.
But there's a model, there's a framework and a reasoning behind why we might approach something in that way, in a very descriptive, curious, compassionate way. To me, these are the fundamentals of how we look after our fellow human beings and ourselves.
Absolutely,
kind of internally reflect on our own life journey.
Yes, we don't usually call it a model because it's a meta framework. It's a broad conceptual umbrella under which a lot of models fit quite comfortably. Narrative therapy, for example, and lots of other things, community psychology, and lots of other things, self-help, peer groups, lots of things you can think of. I'm sure it's not a model as such because it's bigger than any particular model. So that's why we use the word framework. Well, I mean, I think,
as you said earlier.
Yeah. So I think if we were less ambitious, we'd run into less trouble, because what you just outlined is, I often say 90% of what's in the framework is not new. We're really not claiming we're the first people to think of this. What we are saying is not only does a lot of this practice exist, but it's actually should replace the diagnostic model. So that's where the threat comes in, because anyone with any investment in the diagnostic model is going to be to some extent under threat because of that. And the concept of power and threat responses, I think, is very relevant here, actually. So if you think of the power that's invested in the diagnostic model, it's in layers, isn't it? I think a lot of people at a very personal level, their identity is invested in it. And I mean, that's fine if they want to identify in that way, but actually anyone who feels their identity is being threatened is likely to kind of find that quite difficult and perhaps not respond very positively. I mean, we have whole services and industries and companies, drug companies built on, based on a diagnostic model. We have whole professionals based on it. And we would argue that, every political party, whether left, right or centre, is to some extent invested in describing the impact of social policy as actually individual mental illness. I don't think, and I include our supposedly left-wing government in the UK. I mean, they're not about to abandon the medical model. Absolutely, they're not. And I think, one way of looking at it is they're not actually what I would call a properly progressive redistributive government, they don't actually want to look at the fact that these soaring rates of so-called mental health problems are very closely tied to, poverty and inequality and discrimination. They don't want to look at that. They're not about to abandon the medical model. So there's a lot of people with a lot of interests who are capable of, who are likely to feel threatened. And so there's been pushback at, a number of those levels.
Is it also very hard to change a paradigm where we have to go out and say there are either, I use the word shortcomings previously, or it could be, complete misunderstandings that has to go out and
grossly inappropriate model. Yeah.
Yeah. Where
serving only the
make
people who
such a
make the
shift. To me, what's interesting is, I see the shift as being non-threatening because we're never threatening people's lived experience. We're never going out and saying, you don't have the experience of feeling deeply depressed, or you don't lose your life experience of whatever the DSM term was, or ICD term, or whatever terminology. And I do see value in some categorization of trying to understand what someone's general mood state. Language is important, and it wouldn't be appropriate for one clinician to talk to another clinician and say, let me take you through the whole context and history, because it's just not efficient enough. There has to be a shortcut, but the shortcut that we've used is very much about there being an illness in the person, a medicalization of their experience rather than an understanding of their experience. And the state can still be true. And we kind of know this anyway. State changes all the time. Even we use the DAS, whether it's 42 or 21 here in Australia for many of our psychometrics. It's quick and easy. But when we look at it, it's only talking about what you've experienced over the last, week. I think it's week or 2 weeks. I think it's week. And that changes. It dramatically changes. It depends on how your week went. And so we know not to put too much stock on that, but it does say something as well. It's one part of an understanding of how someone's currently going.
Yeah. It's a part we don't need, in my view. So we need shortcuts, but we need shortcuts that aren't phrased based on medical assumptions or medical terminology. So, and we've discussed this quite a lot in the PTMF, and we've come up with several ways of thinking about that. But one is, our general principle is ordinary language always works better. So, true, you're communicating with a clinician, you don't want to kind of go to the person's entire history. But on the other hand, the shorthands that we're encouraged to use, bipolar disorder or whatever they are, aren't actually proper communication. That doesn't solve the problem. What does bipolar disorder tell you? Absolutely nothing. Nothing useful, certainly. So we need a different kind of shorthand, and we have a lot of these. We could talk about trauma reactions. We could talk about bereavement responses. We can talk about I don't know. I think quite a lot about kind of transitions from childhood to adulthood, or all different kinds of there's a whole string of ways which are actually more useful, more accurate. They don't sound so technical, but actually they don't need to. But another thing we've tried to do in the framework is
Can I just jump in? Can I just jump in before you go? Actually, so logical when I think about it, because there's a framework in my mind saying, well, how do you communicate with because the assumption says you still need a category, rather than saying, but if a category is so basic that it doesn't, that it robs the explanation, what are you there for even explaining? So that's fascinating as well, because my mindset has always been that, what do you replace it with? We still need a different category to, we need an overarching label, right? And maybe maybe there's value in questioning that and saying, well, if you're going to be using any words, let's take the time to use extra words to describe it, so we're actually providing some value rather than doing a category and then no one knows what's going on. I mean, even the way it stands at the moment, if someone says, oh, this person's experiencing depression, well, if you actually even look how it's built into the DSM, I don't know which of the criteria. I know the criteria met, but I don't know which ones, is A. Is item 1, 6, 3, and 9 met of the criteria A. You don't know. You just give them one. So it hasn't told you anything.
No, it's told you nothing.
Yeah, but you could quite easily say, they're grieving, and more
absolutely.
Context, they're grieving a change in their identity around their job, what they bring to their family, what it means to them. That says a whole lot more than depression.
Well, absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. I mean, I totally agree. And I'd go further than you, because I'd say not just depression or, clinical depression doesn't tell you anything. I would say it actually actively gives the wrong message because it does have medical overtones. It's not a kind of neutral tell you nothing. It's a kind of reinforcement of a sort of diagnostic way of thinking, however loosely you use it.
Yeah, there's an inadvertent message. Absolutely. There's a secondary, there's a secondary message that's left behind. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. And also, I would say, why do we think we need categories in relation to human emotional suffering? Why do we expect suffering to come in neat parcels? The only reason we think we need a category is because we haven't freed ourselves enough from medical model thinking. You do need these categories in oncology or, whatever branch of medicine you might be thinking of. But I mean, whoever thought that suffering comes in neat bundles? Of course it doesn't. So, but what we may find useful is common themes. That's a rather different way of thinking about it. So we actually spend a lot of time agonizing about exactly the issue you just brought up, which is, well, how do we describe people in, how do we group this together? How do we we can't treat everyone as the first instance of, I've never seen anything like this before. We want to communicate something about it. Seems to be this kind of thing seems to be going on, or this kind of, this is what we suspect may be underneath this person's difficulties. How do we do that? So in a medical model, we're offered lots of kind of false patterns, like, well, it's their chemical imbalance, or it's their genetic flaws, or it's the whatever else. So that's the attempt to squeeze it into a medical diagnostic paradigm. And in fact, any scientific paradigm depends on identifying categories, such as, in medicine, this is cancer and this is diabetes and so on, because unless you have those categories, you can't, they form the basis of the knowledge that builds up the body of science. Unless you know what you're dealing with, this is a cancer cell, or this is, some dysfunction of the pancreas or whatever, you can't get any further. But we do not have those in psychiatry. And the ones we've been offered, it's a chemical imbalance of all kind of collapsed, as Joanna explained to you, but as you probably knew anyway. So our very fundamental question was, what kind of patterns do we look for in relation to human emotional suffering? And categories based on biology are not going to be appropriate. And after a lot of thinking and agonizing, what we came up with is we don't need categories, but we need patterns which are fundamentally shaped by meaning rather than shaped by biology and biological functions in the body. So it's a slightly complicated concept, but you can think of it like a bigger version of an individual formulation. So, a one-to-one narrative or formulation about, let's take an example, a woman who's been sexually abused. You wouldn't be surprised to find that this woman feels, ashamed and guilty, and it's some of her fault, and she's dealing with with it in all sorts of quite common ways, like, self-harm or, self-criticism. You wouldn't be surprised to find that. And the reason you wouldn't be surprised to find that is because it's part of a very general theme that operates, in some ways at a societal level, doesn't it? These themes have deep roots. How are women meant to feel about, what happens to their bodies and whether it's their fault, and who has a right to behave like this towards them, and do we acknowledge this as a society? It ends up with intense feelings of personal shame and guilt. So the patterns that we're talking about are in a sense like meta formulations or meta narratives. And we've made an attempt to start to outline what those patterns might look like. So they're broad level narratives. There's a number of them in the Power Threat Meaning Framework. There's some more on the website. And they cover common situations like women who are survivors of domestic violence, for example, or a typical pattern that applies not just to, but very commonly to men who end up in prison. They're typically the products of, just marginalized families where there was a lot they witnessed and were on the receiving end of a lot of violence. I mean, so we would say that these are evidence-based patterns. They're based fundamentally on meaning. Unlike patterns in general medicine, they're not fundamentally based on what happens to our bodies. Although, of course, they can include our bodies because, all our experiences are reflected in some way at the level of the body, but we're not seeing what goes wrong in the body, a hypothesized chemical imbalance, as a primary cause. We're seeing it as a way that every other human experience is mediated, if you like. Every experience is mediated through our bodies. I don't know if that makes sense, but you end up with something, with different ways of communicating common patterns and themes that you see with clients or with anybody, with all of us.
And obviously using ordinary language when that becomes a part of your repertoire, you develop a language set, or you've offered it in the PTMF meta framework around having still patterns that are recognizable. But we're using more ordinary language that obviously also shapes even the way that we think about it, the way that we discuss it with our clients, because that even in and of itself changes the meaning that a client places on themselves. That is the narrative, right? That forms the narrative. Narrative comes in language, and so
it's evolving, and that's another way in which these are different from medical patterns. These patterns necessarily evolve across cultures and through time because meanings change, because cultures change. So our bodies work more or less the same as they always have done. Diabetes looks the same in rural Brazil as it does in, New York, let's say, but meanings which shape the expression and experience of our distress necessarily change. And that's a big problem for DSM, because you have all these, from Western perspectives, unusual ways of expressing distress in non-Western cultures, and DSM doesn't know what to do with those. So they're squeezed into a chapter called culture-bound syndromes, which is kind of a way of saying this may be a form of schizophrenia we only see in China, but we haven't quite decided yet, which is kind of nonsense, because from a PTF perspective, all expressions of distress are culture bound. You can't get away from culture. Things that seem the obvious way of expressing distress in westernized cultures are still culture bound. It's just we can't see it because we're deeply embedded in that culture. So if you look at it this perspective, it solves a number of other problems, like what about these apparently strange and unusual expressions of distress in Japan or whatever? Well, what do you expect? It's a different culture. They're going to experience and express it in a different way. And, you could have a pattern to explain that, couldn't you? If you knew enough about Japanese culture, you'd be able to kind of outline the meta-narrative around that.
And it would require great curiosity to then step into that culture and understand that culture. What does it mean to be a Japanese child born into that culture from these parents who have experienced these things, and there's a narrative that goes along with societal norms, and their value systems in general, how schools work, how social
Exactly, all of it.
interpersonal relationships occur, the language that they use as well for each other. I know in my Serbian heritage,
Oh, interesting.
there's
You
a
would have
culture
you
within
would
that.
have your own particular cultural patterns, I'm sure, and cultural shaping.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and to observe that as a migrant family, coming to Australia and watching mum and dad's culture against the culture that I'm adopting, or I suppose more rapidly adopting,
Yeah.
as a child, those two worlds having different meanings, and sometimes they're conflicted and you're confused. Where do you fit and all those normal things, and that
Yeah,
becomes,
yeah.
I suppose, my narrative. But I
That's very
really like
interesting.
that. Yeah, I like this idea of really taking a deep dive, uh, yeah, of a history taking. This is a different type of history taking. This is an exploration in much finer detail about, I suppose, those fundamental questions that you noted at the very beginning. Just what happened to you?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not glossing over that. As a matter of fact, even that question, not what's brought you here, because what's brought you here is usually a symptom-based type of instant
Yeah.
conversation rather than what happened. What
Yeah. I
what
mean,
happened?
having said that, the PTF narrative, I think, often does need to start with what happened to you because you need to start where people are. So in that case, you'd be kind of working backwards. But if you're thinking of the framework as a conceptual document, you would start the other way around from the power, if you like.
Yes, yes, yes. And when I think about it, even now, when I use a Gottman therapy informed practice with when I'm working with couples, uh,
Yeah.
there's this really nice beginning, which really starts at how did you two meet?
Yes. Well, that's a kind of what happened to you question, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it diffuses all the tension from the room because it doesn't say, what brought you here. Ah, it's infidelity. Ah, this,
Yeah. Yeah.
immediately
What are
puts
the
tension in the
horrendous
room,
problems you're facing? Yes.
right? And yeah, I'm saying that a little bit from experience, right? Thankfully, not anymore. You starting from that premise, is very. I think it's a kind, gentle, beautiful, and respectful way to begin. It says, "I want to know. I want to
Yes.
understand."
I want to see the world through your eyes. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Wow, wow. Uh,
Can I just add something onto that?
please, please.
So, I mean, just to clarify, the diagnostic model has been exported to cultures that don't have it and don't need it, in my view, in a way that I think is one of the bigger scandals of our current age. Usually exported in very narrow reductionist forms, kind of everyone in the village lines up and gets a pill and the drug companies make a lot of money out of it. And it's not our intention that the framework should fall into that trap. We're not about exporting the framework
Yes,
because our whole understanding is that cultures already, before they're colonized by westernized ways of thinking that are fundamentally unhelpful, they have their own ways of creating narratives. So just briefly, a way of illustrating that, one of the things I did with the framework is go to New Zealand, and I did a 2-day workshop, and I asked for a number of Maori people to be present in the audience, the indigenous people of New Zealand, as I'm sure you know. And the first day I presented the framework, and the second day they presented their understanding of distress. So we did this fascinating compare and contrast. And of course, their ways as different as you could possibly get from my way. No PowerPoints. They sat and they shared stories and we sung and they talked about the stories of the Sky Father and the Earth Mother and the battles they have and the adventures they go on and, what their children get up to and so on. And this is their way of understanding, of creating stories around distress. So someone that is in distress in a Maori whānau or iwi tribe, then a whole group of people together would get together and share stories. And as far as I can understand it, the stories of the gods would kind of we hoped to illuminate the struggle that this a particular person was having and set it in a kind of cultural context. And this would be a very healing ritual and narrative. So couldn't have a bigger contrast, even though the PTM is non-diagnostic, it was certainly very different from that. But as we had this discussion across cultures, what seemed to emerge was that we were both, in our very different ways, presenting narrative-based understandings. And we were both, in our very different ways, presenting stories of power, threat, meaning, and threat response, because that's what human interaction's about, whether it's the Sky Father exercising his power or, me talking about UK politics exercising power. And I was very gratified to hear that in New Zealand they have a couple of clinics which are actually set up to offer Maori understandings, not diagnostic understandings. And the psychiatrist who helped to set these up, who I met, said that the framework had been very helpful to help her argue for these clinics. Not that they use the framework in their clinics because they don't have to, because they have their own narrative ways of understanding distress, but in order to argue that it's culturally appropriate and necessary and extremely valid for them to have space to have their own narrative-based understandings of distress and not be forced into medical understanding. Hope that kind of makes sense.
Absolutely.
So I think the cross-cultural stuff is kind of important, really. But
it's extremely important to remove tension out of the room, and I think when the tension is reduced, it allows for much more curiosity and understanding, and therefore meaning making. And there isn't even a requirement to feel better.
No.
Because there's almost something implicitly leaning into when you go and see a psychologist. There's already a meaning around that, which is there's something wrong with me. I'm supposed to leave feeling better. And by virtue of even going to see a psychologist means there's something wrong with me. That's that stigma that we've always, been trying to fight against. And there's so many aspects. I think that there's so much interwoven in this when we start looking at it from this in terms of all these inadvertent messages that are
absolutely
occurring within our society. And one of those being, as you mentioned, a medical model has many unintended ideas that come along with it.
It does. It carries a whole lot of other messages with it.
Yes. Yeah. In terms of the training, I'm mindful of time. I wish I had, I could follow you around for the next 12 months. In terms of finding out more, because this is really, we're just skimming the surface. Like a lot of philosophies, and I practice myself acceptance and commitment therapy. I feel it's a very kind and thoughtful and transdiagnostic, at least the way I like to practice it. A version of trying to support human beings in their human experiences. But I feel like it needs continuous self-reflection about what do these terms mean, how do they relate to one another. That this is even Stephen Hayes, the father of ACT, so to speak, talks about it being a process-based therapy more so these days than these kind of core processes. Instead, it's like, no, they're all kind of evoked at the same time in trying to understand how someone's interacting with the world. This being a philosophy that we're talking about, or a meta framework, so to speak, where do we go to find out more, and how do we hone these, hone this understanding and bring this into our practice? Where can we go to?
Well, almost everything you might possibly need is on the main website. So it's got a number of sections. It's got the growing number of articles and kind of evaluations of the framework in different settings. It's got a section called Good Practice Examples. It's got video links. It's got podcasts. It's got shorter versions of the framework. That there's lots and lots of stuff out there.
And that is on
It's on the BPS website. I think I've sent the link. So
lovely. We will make sure that we link that in our show notes so that everyone can find that. And I can see that here on my end. It's just bps.org.uk/, and then it's got member, network, division, etc.
That one.
Meaning framework. So it's quite long, but I'll make sure I link that. You've published a book as well, along with your colleagues. Can you maybe?
Yes. So the book, I think I've sent you the link to that as well. It's by Boyle and Johnston. I mean, it's unlike the documents. It's not free, but it's relatively cheap. I hope you can get it from Amazon. You have Amazon in Australia, I assume.
Yes.
So, and it's a little bit like a kind of talk you through the steps in a kind of way that might help you to construct a narrative for yourself or for someone you're working with or supporting. So that's a more practical, what might this look like in real life version.
And is there training as well that your colleagues do? Where could people go? Is there anything online? Mainly face-to-face workshops.
Well, we do training kind of on request, if you like. So I mean, that's what I do nowadays. It's an unexpected late stage of my career. I do training around the UK, but also further afield. But we respond to people's invitations. That's part of the whole ethos. If people are interested, they can come to us and we'll do our best to meet their requests. But we're not about kind of rolling this out and imposing it on people. You're a little bit far away for me to pop in and do some training in Canberra. I mean, you could certainly, if there are particular organisations or people who want to get in touch, we could certainly think about offering some online sessions or training. I've done that to Australia a couple of times in collaboration with other people and further afield. So that would be the way to do it.
Before I let you go, what are your hopes within this I suppose chapter, this framework, this philosophy? What are your hopes, and maybe you can even speak to the hopes that you've maybe heard from your peers about what happens, what's the future look like?
Happens? I and the other authors, we kind of decided as a principle in a way, we've done it. If people are interested, it'll take off. If they're not, it won't. So I didn't want to get hooked up in, and I don't think I'm hooked up in, this has got to happen and these people have got to like it. I entirely trust the process, so to speak. And if this is as far as it ever goes, it's already infinitely more than we ever anticipated. So that's great. So I don't exactly have hopes, but developments I'd be particularly pleased to see are, I think, partly, maybe even mainly, the general public getting better informed about this stuff, because, I think the psychiatric paradigm is crumbling, but the thing that will most quickly bring it to its knees, and where, revolutions always start at the grassroots in a way. I think services, there are some very impressive projects, for example, in London inpatient wards, based on the framework, showing significant changes in culture, reduced levels of seclusion and restraint and so on. But services are only get changed to a certain point. What we need is for ordinary people to be saying, this is not what I want, thanks, for myself, for my relative, whatever, and to be enlightened about the kind of lies they've been told, essentially. And ideally, we need kind of policymakers to get on board with this, don't we? Because again, against policymakers at a very senior level will start taking this stuff on board, essentially it's going to keep rolling on. Those would be two hopes, if you like.
And there has to be some consideration over time whereby we, as countries, policies, big initiatives, continue to throw more and more resources. We train more and more people up. We provide more and more services, yet the outcomes are not showing up, considering what we're throwing at it.
Well, they're not showing. No, I mean, actually, I've worked in mental health services for a long time myself, had very many valued, hardworking colleagues doing their very best, but it's like pushing a stone uphill. They're within a system that is based on fundamentally false premises. It's very difficult to help people properly within that. And services overall, mental health services, are far better at creating than curing what we might, mental illness, if we want to put it like that. They're typically about turning people into lifelong psychiatric patients. It's not just that they don't help, they actively harm. And that's routinely, that's standard. Some people get help, and I like to think that I was of help to some people, but that's not the general picture. So no, I mean, a colleague of mine often says, we don't want more money for mental health services if we're going to produce more of the same. And I mean, I very much agree with that.
I suppose there's lots of things that have unintended consequences, and that's hard for all of us to grapple with, even in the framework that we've discussed today. We're trying to untangle people's experiences and their meaning, what they've understood, and all these secondary things that occur. Sometimes it's so easy to see. For example, in our clinic, we see lots of clients who are going through very difficult life transitions with their work. It usually looks like a compensatory claim. Cost on them emotionally is so highly distressing for an expectation that may or may not be met, and many years can be lost in this process of going through that. So I think there's a fundamentally challenge system there that has so many competing demands and does need reform, review, reconsideration, whatever we call it. And in a similar way, I think that there's value to re-examine how do we look at well-being, how do we look at human experience, how do we look at distress, that whole point of understanding human distress. That is a valid pillar starting post to re-examine, not say we already know. Philosophy says we don't. We need to continue to think about it. We need to keep pushing that, and that's what I love about what I'm hearing today. Is this isn't the psychologist? No, we're a conduit of supporting clients in understanding, and for us to understand simultaneously. So we're not the bearers of the knowledge, and that I've got it, and then I'm going to impart it on you. There's another power dynamic that's called dependency, and it also infers there's something wrong with me. That complexity has to be understood, and this certainly sounds like a very kind and compassionate approach that deserves a lot of consideration. And I will certainly be one that reads much further beyond, and then hopefully in my work and it can kind of spread through that mechanism, and hopefully listeners as well. So I thank you so much for your time. I appreciate the work that you do, Lucy, and your colleagues as well. This is never a one-man band that does it all, but being a torchbearer for trying to think about this in a different way, and there's some braveness, courage that goes along with this, because I imagine holding a title of psychologist comes with responsibility in today's age, and that can be a scary proposition of potentially losing that or being threatened, and all those things that happen for us as well, because we're human as well. So I thank you for your work and being courageous, and also I think looking at this in a different way than the mainstream is helpful to examine. So I hope listeners have got great value, as I have from today. So thank you again.
It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. And I think you'll like the framework when you have 6 months free to read the long document. I think you'll find a lot to agree with, but it's been a pleasure to discuss it with you. Thank you.